Have you ever asked yourself what kind of car guy you are? Maybe you're an off-roader, a racer or a showgoer. But is there a worse duffer than the hoarder who's waiting for that perfect time? It's just a thought. Here's how I got on with the Esprit. Please like, share and subscribe. So we've a lump on the floor and a chassis to strip. And you know, this time you're going to get a little bit of a closer look at this chassis and some of the issues that we've got to work out. Everything else in this car, I'm quietly confident, or at least not phased at the prospect of fixing. But this chassis, it's been abused. And here's some of the angles on it that I really like. And these are Speedline wheels. They're Italian and they look it, but as far as I know, they were designed in-house at Lotus. And onto our lump. And it's time to split the box off this and get it out of our way so we can pull the chassis back into the floor. There should be, I think 10 or 11 bolts holding the trans to the engine. We're shy a few. There's one missing up here near the starter motor. This is the sump plug actually, and there are two missing at the bottom of the bell housing where they should bolt the bell housing to the sump. A fairly good indication that these two units have been apart before. So anyway, none of these bolts are going to be an issue, and let's get them out. Let's have a quick look at this. The hole in this bell housing, it's kind of roughly hewn. Now maybe somebody's been levering through this bell housing for some reason with a long spanner or a crowbar or something. But the reason this hole is there is so that the engine can be timed, because obviously the timing belt is up at the other end of the engine, which lives very snug up against the bulkhead. It would be extremely difficult to time this car the conventional way. So you time it through this hole. Now I'm guessing, but it's an educated guess. So all the bolts are out and the starter motor stayed exactly where it was. And you know these things aren't light. It was just a little bit bound to the engine, so off that came. And I started to tease the gearbox off the engine. Now when you're doing this, you're supposed to have everything level. So you have to try and separate an engine and gearbox without levering either one of them off the other. Now here's the clutch pressure plate set up, and you can see the diaphragm spring here. This is in really good nick. It's polished slightly, but that's normal, but it's not grooved or worn out. And one of the ways that can happen is if you drive with your foot resting on the clutch. So you might not notice it, but you're depressing the clutch slightly, which is running the input bearing against this diaphragm spring, and that wears it down. And now you can see, here are timing marks on the flywheel. And here's the input shaft. When I went to test it for play, there was a huge amount of wobble in it, which freaked me out. I thought this thing's been abused. But it turns out this has a kind of a two-piece input system where this part of the input shaft is almost floating. There is a spring behind it. It's designed to have a bit of movement in it, which is kind of cool. I'm not sure why, I don't know much about it, but we'll figure that out again. Now watch as I pull the bolts out of this pressure plate. You'll see the diaphragm spring release. And here's the friction plate. And it's not massively worn, there's still plenty of life left in it, but it has bound itself to the flywheel. There's no way this is the original clutch. And I want to say this flywheel's in good nick, but there's no way of knowing until we clean it up. And the crankshaft end seal, I can't decide whether this has been weeping or not. It does look a bit oily, but there's oil kind of all over the engine. It's one of the bigger crank end seals I've ever seen. Okay, let's spin this engine round, get it onto the hoist so we can get it onto an engine stand. And let me tell you this, what you have watched so far took 8 hours to achieve. I reckon I could split the gearbox off this engine and put it onto an engine stand in less than an hour, probably in half an hour. So there you go. That'll give you an idea of how much extra time the stop motion puts into everything. On stage comes the chassis. And we're going to start from the front and work our way back. And the first thing I'm going to do is start wire brushing all of the fasteners and hitting them with penetrating fluid so that we give ourselves the best chance. The plan is that by the time we get the last one wire brushed and lubricated, the first one will have marinated long enough to smooth our progress. The fan mounts, the lower arm fasteners, and the various clips and hose clamps on the cooling system. I'm not going to touch the brake lines just yet. They're not crucial to us being able to get the chassis turned round so we can work on it. And here are the bolts on the steering rack. They bolt through brackets that are welded onto the chassis. These could be a bit of a problem if they're seized. What I found all the way across this car is most of the fasteners either use captive nuts or nylon lock nuts. Now everything's been sitting around for a while and we should be able to attack it all fairly quickly. I didn't even waste my time trying to get the hose clamps off. I just cut through the inboard ones. And luckily the steering rack bolts played ball first time. So down to the end of the track rods and I took the ball joints out. Time to have a stab at the springs, and I wasn't sure these spring compressors that I have for the Land Rover were going to fit into the tight spaces to get these springs out. And if you keep an eye on the top ends of the spring compressors, they really are barely fitting into these gaps. So off with the damper top bolt and then the upper ball joint bolts on the upper wishbone, and this wishbone wasn't free at all, which isn't a good sign, but we'll keep on moving. So I tried releasing the lock nut on the top of that, but no, I think we've got a seized mounting bolt here. Now I'm going to release the anti-roll bar as well, just to give us a bit more wiggle room. And you can see the upright and hub are just being held by the bottom ball joint and the brake line. What's happening here is I'm loosening the bottom bolt of the damper, letting that come out the bottom of the lower arm, and then the spring is ready to just almost fall out. Now these brake lines, there's no way they're going back on the car. The swaged end was the weak point in this system when the heat built up inside the brake lines and it just popped open. And look at these cast iron uprights, they just look so delicate. But the hub is now off. So we move to the offside. Spring compressors on, damper top bolt off, ball joint out of the wishbone, and this upper wishbone seems a lot more free. However, the bottom of the damper, this is the first proper sticking point we've had. The bolt goes through a kind of tubular spacer in the bottom of the damper and it has fully seized in there. Now you can get up underneath this lower arm and I could probably get in there with a grinder, but not where this car is sitting at the moment. And I got the torch out and got a lot of heat going in this bolt on both ends, and then I went at it with the hammer. And what I have done is I've gone a bit too heavy on this, and the bottom arm is now out of whack because it's gotten too many whacks. And that was a big eye-opener and a bit of a leveler, because I am not working on a Land Rover here. I am very much used to big, robust Land Rover parts that can take a good beating. But as I said at the beginning of the series, this car will take a little bit of finesse in its restoration in the work that I'm doing to it. So I'm kind of glad that happened. It's not the end of the world. We'll take it under advisement. We'll probably straighten this arm one way or the other. And if we have to replace it, we will. So anyway, following the same process as on the other side, I dropped out the anti-roll bar, even though it wouldn't actually release from the arm. I went for the castellated nut on the lower ball joint of the upright. I pulled the spring out and then I went for the brake line. And this time I popped it on purpose. Just for the crack. I pulled the bottom arms off by releasing them from their inner mountings. So the whole anti-roll bar unit and bottom arms have come out as one long unit. And we'll free all that up and appraise everything later on. Now, let's go for these upper wishbones. This is the offside one. Thankfully, we had no problems here. But on the near side one, as predicted, very very seized. And you can see on the end of this nylon lock nut, I've already wailed on it and pretty much destroyed it. Now I was hoping to get away without destroying the mounting bolt, but I've hit it hard enough that it's expanded, it's flattened out at its end, even though the nut was on it. So I've given up on getting this off this time because I wanted to keep moving, but I guess we're going to have to cut this bolt and this wishbone off the chassis. So what's left up here? Well, the coolant pipes. The big ones come out forwards, but I think the smaller ones come out to the rear. So I'm going to release these hoses off them one way or the other. I worked at getting at least one of these wire clamps off the hoses intact. The rest of them I just cut off because they're seized. Even if they weren't, they're kind of ropey. I don't want to put them back on the car. We'll get new ones. So finally, back to the rear of the car, I pulled the fuel pump and its associated plumbing out first. And then I went for the cooling pipes, starting with the big ones. And here are the two main pipes that run through the chassis and the hoses that take them through 90 degrees where they enter the engine bay. This is all really simple stuff. All of the hose clamps were free. They didn't give any resistance. And there was still a little bit of coolant or water or some kind of fluid left in some of these pipes. I drained that out. And the engine bay is starting to look a bit more clear. And here is the handiwork of some troglodyte. Some of the damage that I've been subtly alluding to. Looking at this and considering that somebody was more than likely paid to do whatever repair that they thought it was necessary to cut a big lump out of this chassis for, well, it reminds me of a nice scene between Kevin Spacey and Al Pacino.
What you're hired for is to help us. Does that seem clear to you? To help us, not to fuck us up.
Anyway, let's keep moving. No sense dwelling on it. Let's get the engine mounts out. And here's that ropey one from the near side. All of this stuff, again, really free and easy. And these have to come out to allow us access to the forward ends of the trailing arms. But I ran out of time, and that is it. I pulled the chassis up off the floor, get it onto the stand, so we're ready to get these last few components of the rear suspension off the next time. And next time we are going to start repairing this chassis. I spoke to the lads about it. I said, what do you think about the possibility of getting it straight? And Cy, the resident expert with a hammer and dolly, said, oh, easy peasy. Now I'm going to do it all, but I'm going to make sure that these guys are casting an eye over my shoulder. Anyway, we've an engine on a stand, and a transaxle on the floor, and a sexy body on some pallets. And very soon, we are going to have a bare chassis on some axle stands too. And every time I see the lettering on the flanks of this car, it gives me this image of somebody lifting the tailgate and pulling a tennis bag out of the back. I don't know, it's just got that 80s tennis vibe, McEnroe kind of New York brash yuppie chic thing going on. Is that any kind of a description? To new patron Alan Malik, Bob Weber, Dan V. Garner, Drew Brownfield, Eduardo Baldi, Eric Backer, Jesper Anderson, Casper Hack, Patrick Bobbitt, Roger Treadwell, Simon, Steve Gurney, Tor Crowell and Zachary Wade Plosh. And to all my patrons, gents, you're legends, one and all, and thank you. If you would like to contribute to my efforts here at Soup, there will be a link in the description to Patreon. Also to a GoFundMe campaign to get Soup a decent welder and to Soup merchandise. That's it, I'm off. Until the next time, don't let anything stop you. Please like, subscribe and share, and good luck.